Hey there, fellow coder. Welcome to this next video in our series where we're building a real-world Java web app from scratch using Spring Boot. Now, in this video, we're going to dive into the concept of security and having the user login screen and everything. We touched on that a little bit in the last episode and maybe the episode before that, but we're going to sort of help finish things off in this video, hopefully, if all goes well. So the first thing I want to say is I want to show you everything that is encountered, all the little quirks of Java or Eclipse or whatever it is that you might be using for developing. And when I loaded up my environment, I get this. The bunch of red lines everywhere, and it says, the implement or the method must override this stuff. And so all these errors that it's giving me, they shouldn't be there. These are all weird errors. So basically, what I do here is I typically do like a Maven clean and compile and install and everything. So just to sort of clean stuff up. And as you can see in the left-hand corner, there's this sort of red exclamation mark. And if you go to problems, it probably says something like, the project can't be built until the build path errors are resolved. So you might say, what's going on here? So if you're using Eclipse, what I would do is I'd right-click and go to Maven and then go to Update Project. If you're not using Eclipse, I would just go to command line and do like an MVN clean install, and maybe you might have to refresh your directory or something, or your project. But for me, because I'm using Eclipse, I'll just go to Update Project, and then I'm going to choose to force update of snapshots and releases, and I'll hit OK. And usually it just does a clean install, build, that kind of thing. And once it's done, usually these strange errors go away. So again, I don't know necessarily what causes these strange errors. But it's been a little while since I've opened up this project, so that could be all that's going on. So I'll let that run in the background while I talk about where we're going to go next. So here, like I was saying in the last video, we have a user that we're loading from our database. And if the user's not found, we throw an exception. And what we'd ideally like to do is just return that user if we have found the user and everything is A-OK. Problem is that this method requires a UserDetails object. So now I'm going to talk about what's going on here. Okay, so if you look at the UserDetails, if I control click on it to go into it and wait for it to attach the source, there you go. If it doesn't attach the source code like you just saw there, and now that it shows something, you can also right click on your project and say Maven download sources. Okay, that's if you don't ever see this code. So the UserDetails, as you can see, it comes from in the package Spring Framework Security. So this is a Spring Security thing, and it's just an interface. It's an interface that has a few things inside of it. So it has a get authorities, get password, get username, and then a bunch of Boolean checks for is account, not expired, that kind of thing. So basically what this is this is an interface that Spring Security wants us to use because it's going to allow Spring Security to properly use our user object. Okay, because if we implement this interface, then we're agreeing to the contract given to us by Spring Security, which is to implement all these sort of methods here. So there's two ways to go about doing this. There's an easy way and a harder way. And as with all things in development, the harder way is probably the better way to go with respect to the design of things. So I'm probably going to end up showing you the harder way, which just allows your code to be more flexible in the future. If you wanted to sub out Spring Security with another provider with respect to security, it makes things just a little bit easier for you. Okay, this is why I'm going to do the harder way, which is sort of the better design. So here's what I won't do. I won't go into our user object and say user implements UserDetails. I will not do this. Okay. Why will I not do this? Well, if I do that, then it's going to force us to add the unimplemented methods that come from the UserDetails contract, the UserDetails interface. So as you can see here, it's going to require us to do all this stuff, to implement all this code, the get and all the is checks and everything. So what that's going to do is it's going to tie Spring Security tightly. It's going to couple Spring Security tightly with our user object. So we want to decouple it as much as possible. Okay, so I will not do this. I will not implement UserDetails here. which means I will be deleting all of this stuff that it automatically brought in. And instead, I'm going to sort of leave my user object untouched, because this is our user object. This is what we want our user object to have. But what I'm going to do instead to satisfy our code here, because it wants us to return a user details, at least an object that implements user details, I'm going to go into the security package, and I'm going to create a custom user. So I'm going to go to class, and I'm going to say, let's say custom user. I'll call it custom security user, because that's kind of the purpose of this class is to leverage it as a security user, specifically a Spring security. So here I'm going to say implements user details. Okay, and I'm going to import it from Spring Security, and I'm going to add the unimplemented methods. Okay, and here I'm going to say, okay, it requires authorities, which extends granted authority. So I'll get into that in a moment, but really all that means is have a set of authority objects. New hash set will do. And this doesn't exist yet, this authority, so I'm going to actually create this authority. And again, this has to do with Spring Security. So I'm going to put this inside of the security package. I'm just going to call it authority. And this authority class needs to extend granted authority, which again, if I go into granted authority, if I go into granted authority, this again comes from Spring Security. And it's just an interface that has one method, which is get authority. So what I can do here is that I've created this empty authority class just now, and I put it into the security package. This should implement the interface that Spring Security wants us to implement, which is granted authority. And we'll import that guy, and then we'll have this add the unimplemented methods, which is just to get the authority. Okay, what is the authority? It's just a string, and like I said, I'll get to that in a moment. But I'm going to say return this dot authority. So just a standard getter method here. I should probably have a setter too. Let me create a setter method. Set authority. There we go. And this probably also wants me to add a serializable. I'll just add a generated serial version UID, probably because granted authority implements serializable. So anyway, let's stay on target. So let me bring in my hash set and everything. So all this is going to do here is when I say get authorities, I can just say return authorities, right? Like that. Okay. So there you go. And then all this other stuff, get password, get username, blah, 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 blah. So all this is going to be defined inside of our custom security user. And again, I'll say the reason why we're doing this in here is because we're trying to keep as much as we can out of our regular user class. Okay, our user class, I want it to be as pristine as possible and have the least amount of coupling, tight coupling with the Spring Security stuff, which again comes in the form of the user details interface. So, okay, we have authorities, then we have our getter here, fantastic. Well, what about get password? Well, here's where we're going to do something special, because password and username exist already inside of our user object. Our user object that we created for the purpose of this FreshVotes application has a username and password. So we don't want to duplicate that functionality. We don't want to duplicate that inside of our custom user. So how we get around that is we extend our user class. Okay, let me import it from FreshVotes. So now when we extend our user class, we can just say return this dot get password. And the reason why I can say get password here, even though there is no password field set here, is because the user object that we are extending from, the user object has a get password method. So when we say return this dot get password, it's really just getting the password from the parent object. Okay. Same goes for username. This dot get username. We can say that because that comes from the parent object. Now, fantastic. What about all these things? Well, these things generally, the way I do this is I just hard code return true for all these. And the reason why is because I don't want to get bogged down with implementing all the details for all these things in the database at this point in time. So let me go over what these are briefly. Is account non-expired? Is account non-locked. Is credentials non-expired? Is enabled. So what this means is these are ways to determine whether or not our user is sort of an active user or not. Okay, so is account not expired? You can almost say, okay, if we have like a subscription service and they have canceled their subscription, then this user you can say maybe is expired. Okay, is the account non-locked? Well, maybe again we're in the same situation. We have a subscription system, and the user for some reason maybe put in their password incorrectly too many times. So we can say, oh, they're now locked out of their account, or maybe they haven't paid their bill when they should have, and therefore we should lock their account. So in any case, for all of these, this is basically just a way to say if any of these return false, you're not going to allow the person to log in. So we're not going to give them the authorization to continue. So they may have authenticated themselves, but now they are not authorized to continue because one of these has returned false. Okay, that's what the purpose of these guys are. So for now, what we're going to do is I'm just going to hard code return true because I'm just going to say, hey, let's not worry about this just yet. We're going to consider any user who types in the correct username and password. We're going to allow them to go in, and we're not going to stop them for whatever reason we can think of here. So that's why I'm just returning true. But that's basically what you can do here is you can store these values in the database, right? This is sort of what you should be doing is storing them in the database, and these should be returning the value from the database, right? Okay, so, and this needs to add a generated serial version ID as well, like so, because UserDetails implements serializable. So we need to do that to appease the serializable gods. Okay, let's see. So there's one other thing that will be an issue here. And it's in the form of authorities. As you can see, this is the only sort of field that we have set here for our custom security user. These authorities need to be stored in the database. All right, and this is where, again, I can go really crazy here, and I can try to decouple this as much as possible from our regular user object. But the thing is, to do this is it's going to make things a lot more complicated. And the reason why this is going to be complicated in terms of having the authorities inside of our custom security user is that the authority is going to be a database table, right? Authority, let me go in here and explain that. This should be an entity, okay? Because we actually have to store this information in the database. Okay, this refers to the roles. In other words, these are the authorities that are given to our user. So if the user is an admin, or if the user is a regular old user, or some sort of special type of user role type of thing, this is how we tell Spring Security. We store this information in the database in the form of roles, which here are just, we call them authority here, but really these are roles. Okay, that's what these are roles. So strings that represent roles. So this needs to be an entity. And because this is an entity, that means that it should have an ID, right? Because if it's a database table, there needs to be some sort of an ID. And there needs to be a relationship. So there needs to be a relationship between the authority, and it should match up to a user, right? So you'd want to put user here, because you need to have some sort of a mapping back to a user that has roles mapped to it, right? But we can't do user right now. We can't map it back to user because the user doesn't have any reference to authorities. So instead, we'd have to do, okay, this has to be a custom security user, is what the type of user is that we have that maintains a reference to authorities. But then if we do that, then this needs to be a database table as well, right? So then this needs to have an ID, but then there needs to still be some sort of a relationship between a user and a custom. So you're adding all these layers of database tables and relationships, and it just makes things really confusing. And there might be a way to do it nicely with Hibernate to have all this mapped out appropriately so there's only two tables. But like I said, that just gets very convoluted. And basically what I do is I just, I bring the authorities, I bring this into the parent object, which is the user object. So I'm going to take authorities out, of the custom security user, and I'm going to put them into the parent user. Okay, so the authorities here will have a getter setter, right? I'll create a getter and setter. And then the custom security user object will just say return this.get authorities, just like we did for all the other ones. Okay, and then what we need to do here is probably need to change this to be a set, because now it doesn't recognize this is a set of authority objects is what it's returning now. So that's how you appease those programming gods there. Okay, so that's essentially how I solved that problem. So now in the authority, when the authority object, now it's not the custom security user I'm referring to, it's just the regular user, and that's a lot easier to do to reference the regular user, because the regular user is already an entity. It's already an entity with a table, and that way we kind of keep everything all in one place. So yes, I know I kind of broke my own rule that I talked about at the beginning here, where I'm now sullying my user object with Spring security code. But like I said, I'm doing that for the purposes of brevity here. I can totally make this work and pull it out, but it's going to take a lot more videos, and I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze for that one. Okay, so now let's finish off our code and get this to a semi-working state. Let's bring our getters and setters in for the user and the ID fields in authority that we just added. The ID needs to be annotated with the standard ID and generated value strategy is identity. Let's see, and then we need to have on the getter, we need to have a mapping, a relationship back to the user, which in this case is not many to many, sorry, many to one. Simple little relationship back to user, and then therefore the user needs to have a relationship on the authorities in the getter. Where's the getter? Getter here. This is a one-to-many. So from the user to authorities, it's one-to-many. From authorities to user, it's many-to-one. And what do we have? Cascade equals all, because if we delete a user, we should delete all of the roles associated to it. Fetch type should be lazy, because lazy is, although more work, it's more efficient on our database. Although typically, maybe I'm changing. Does it need to be lazy? I might change my mind there, because whenever you're loading a user, you probably should have the authorities anyway. So I think that's okay to make it eager. Mapped by, what do we call this? User on the other side, and authority we call, yeah, user was the field name here, so that's mapped by user. Okay, so that should appease that, and it should be good in terms of the relationship. So when we start up our code or our server, it should create the authority table, and it should have the appropriate stuff stored in there, and the mapping back to the user and everything, the foreign key and whatnot. But now going back to the original problem. At the beginning of this video, our problem was we couldn't put return user here. Okay, so how do we do this now? How do we say, hey, our user is a custom security user, right? Or rather the other way around, a custom security user has user details. So we need to return a custom security user is really what we need to do here, right? So how the heck do we do that? Well, we return a new custom security user. Okay, so we return it, when we return a new custom security user, the error goes away, but we're not done, because if we return a new custom security user, all that's going to do is create a brand new user or a custom security user that extends another user, and it's going to be brand new, and is not going to have any of the values that we loaded from our database. Okay, so this new custom security user is just going to be a blank empty object. So how do we populate this custom security user with the stuff that we loaded from our database? Well, I'm going to pass into this. This is a constructor. We're saying new something, so this is a constructor. I'm going to create a new constructor by passing in our user object. Okay, this doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to create a constructor whereby we pass in the user object, and then we just have to do some annoying stuff where we manually set everything. So we set authorities equal to the user get authorities. We set the ID equal to the user.getID. We set the name equal to user.getName. We go through every single one. User.get password. And oops, this.set username is user.get username. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new custom security user, and I'm copying everything over from the user that we passed in. So this user that we're passing in comes from the database. So this will have all of those values inside of here. Okay. And also when we create, I think because of Spring, the way things work, whenever you have an object and you create a constructor that has an argument in it, you should also create the no argument constructor. So I'm just going to create an empty no argument constructor here just so that it doesn't complain later, because oftentimes you need to have this if you have another type of constructor. I know, syntactical noise that comes in with Java. You just have to deal with it. So now when I save my code here, everything is cool, everything is happy. And now when we return a new custom security user, it's going to be populated with the values that we've loaded from our user from the database. And now we haven't really sullied our user object too much. We only have one thing that we brought in that comes from Spring Security. So now in the future, if we want to pull Spring Security out and put something else in, we only have to deal with this. Which in my opinion isn't bad anyway, because this whole authority thing is just going to be deleted, right? So in the future, we would just delete this completely, and then delete the authority object completely, and then we're fine, right? And then we delete the custom security user, and then bring in whatever other implementation we want to. So like I was saying, the juice isn't worth the squeeze in my opinion for all the rest of it, because you can just easily delete it, and then you're good to go. Anyway, so there you go. Now if I fire up my server, run a Spring Boot app, it should, if all goes well, start up correctly, and then it should create a new, let me switch over to my database, refresh my tables. There we go. We have an authority table now, which has an ID, an authority as a string, and a reference, foreign key reference back to the user via a user ID. Excellent. So after all that, we're done here. We've implemented our user details service. We've implemented our user details. So now we can flip things over and actually implement. Have I done that yet inside of web security configuration? I have the user. Okay, good. So we're in the situation now where we can actually test this out and log in with a user that comes from the database. But we will save that for the next video, because there's a little bit that we need to do in order to get that working properly, because I don't think we have a user stored in our table yet. So if I go to select star from users, do we have a user in there? No, we don't. So we're going to have to insert a user in there and then create the appropriate authority for that user, and also do some password encoding because we're using the password encoder here. So we'll tackle that one in the next video, and then we should be done our Spring security topic, and we'll be able to get into actual real domain logic with respect to creating our FreshVotes application. Okay, but like I said, one more video on security, and then we will be on our way to building out this application. Looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care of yourself. Happy learning. And bye for now.